Good morning. My name is Patty Flather. I'm with the Communications Branch of Energy Mines and Resources. Thank you for joining us this morning. Firstly, I respectfully acknowledge that we are here today on the traditional territories of the Kwanlin First Nation and the Ta'an Quechan Council, in what's also known as Whitehorse. As a settler, I am grateful to live, work, and raise my family on these lands and waters stewarded by these First Nations for millennia. I also respectfully acknowledge that the heap leach failure took place on the traditional territory of the First Nation of Nacho-Nayak-Dun, with catastrophic impacts to the environment that are still being remediated. Today's technical briefing will focus on the Independent Review Board's final report that assessed the heap leach failure of June 24th, 2024 at Victoria Gold's Eagle Gold Mine. The report outlines the technical causes of the incident and offers recommendations aimed at improving mining oversight and minimizing future risk. Joining us this morning to talk about this report are the authors, Mark Smith, who is here with us in person, and Jean-Marie Conrad, joining online. It's important to note that the Independent Review Board operates independently. Their work was fully independent from government, funded through the court-supervised receivership process for Eagle Gold. A reminder that the focus today is on the work of the Independent Review Board. The scope of the board's work was not to assign responsibility for the failure, but was to determine the cause of the incident. The report's findings are robust and its recommendations are clear. Now that we have this information, the Government of Yukon is reviewing it thoroughly to determine the appropriate next steps. We understand that members of the media will have specific questions about the Government of Yukon's response. As the Government of Yukon determines the path forward, we will be looking at how to best implement the board's findings. Please direct any questions not related to the IRB report to us after today's briefing. The Government of Yukon is facilitating today's briefing to provide a forum for media to ask questions about the report. Please direct your questions to the IRB members. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Mark Smith, here joining us in the room, is a professional engineer with 45 years of experience in gold heap leaching, including the last 12 years working on several cold climate projects. He principally works as a senior reviewer, member of geotechnical review boards, and on failure prevention and response teams. Jean-Marie Conrad is a geotechnical expert with a master's degree from Université Laval and a doctorate degree from the University of Alberta. For the last 25 years, he has consulted on various projects related to artificial freezing, permafrost engineering, dam construction and safety assessment, and has been a member on several independent peer review boards in the mining industry. Their PowerPoint presentation will be available to members of the media after the briefing. Let us know where we can email this to each of you. Mr. Smith and Mr. Conrad, over to you.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'll lead the presentation, and Dr. Conrad or Jean-Marie can join in as he sees fit, and probably most engaging during the question and answer period. I'm going to move through the slides pretty fast and keep this high level. I actually like the Q&A sessions for these kinds of talks. Those are my favorite part, and I think that's where most of the value gets interchanged, and that's very much a two-way interchange. So let's go to the first slide. In fact, I think we've already covered the first slide, maybe. The next slide, I mean. Yeah, so the scope of the investigation was to determine the mechanical causes, or the geomechanical causes as we call them, and I'll talk briefly about that, and then I'll walk through the major stages of this investigation and get into a little bit of detail starting down around the initial determinations and causes, and I'll give a high-level flavor for the recommendations, but I won't go into the recommendations because it's a reasonably long list. So next slide, please. And Jean-Marie, you speak up whenever you want to say something or point out one of my very frequent errors. So yeah, Jean-Marie and I were the board members and the primary co-authors of the report. There were 3 technical advisors who had a significant hand throughout the entire process, including writing portions of the appendices and editing, helping to edit the entire process, as well as the one board member who left the board in March, and we mentioned Les, who was a fantastic contributor during the process of the study, and we thank Les for his contributions. The next slide. So we were formed to focus on technical causation, not to place blame or determine who specifically or which company specifically is to fault in this. That's a different kind of investigation and really can't start until the technical evaluations are done. The scope ranged from studying all the plausible modes of failure to coming up with what we have as a relatively detailed list of specific recommendations. The recommendations do not focus just on the Eagle failure, but are meant to more broadly improve both the practice of mining and the regulation of mining in the Yukon, as well as the broader industry. 2024 saw the two most catastrophic failures in the 45-year history of heap leaching, and we are hoping that this document will help lead all of the heap leach jurisdictions and heap leach companies to better practices. The recommendations at the end are all real-world recommendations that have been successfully implemented elsewhere. They come from best industry practices and from published technical documents, guidelines, and standards, and many are adapted from the tailings disposal field. Some of those are in documents currently being drafted and will be published in the near term, and we actually will speak to those in the documents. You actually see some citations for documents that don't exist yet. Those are forthcoming, so it's kind of like a pre-release. Next slide. So the investigative report was very hands-on. We started with a site visit, and I actually went to the site before the RB was formed, and then most of the rest of the members went in the middle of September sometime. We had quite a bit of interaction with the library of documents held in the public record, as well as held by Victoria Gold Corp. There was a lot of back and forth with the receiver, and the receiver manages, I'm not sure if manage is the right word, but they control the operations of Victoria Gold now, and there was a lot of interaction one-on-one with current Victoria Gold people, in part in finding the right kinds of documents. The operation's been around for a number of years, and so there's a mountain of documents, so going through those and finding the right ones to look at took some real effort on everybody's part. We also had some meetings with the geotechnical engineers that are currently working on the project, both for the Yukon government and for the receiver as part of the remediation. And we had interviews with both current and former VGC employees. Next slide. We also, through the receiver and through VGC current employees, we obtained samples of different ore types, including the ore that we ultimately believe is at the root of the failure. We also got liner samples to test the liner behavior, especially after some of it had been exposed to the weather. We engaged our own independent engineering companies to work for us. They were contracted through the receiver, but they worked exclusively at our direction, so we had technical control over their work. And you'll see their work product throughout our report and predominantly in the appendices. We used all of that work to help us develop our hypotheses of the failure and then our theories of the failure, to perform the substantial numerical modeling that was done to simulate the failures, and then to both help us support our conclusions, but as well as to refine them. So when we would get an idea that we needed more data, we'd go get that data, and then that would sometimes change our direction, more often fine-tune our understanding. Next slide. The study started pretty early, though, in trying to understand, or not trying, understanding the specific nature of this failure. This is unquestionably a liquefaction flow slide. It's a word I should know how to say since I've written it so many times. Liquefaction is a very specific set of geomechanical and hydrogeologic behaviors that have a history of causing the most catastrophic failures in all of geotechnical engineering. and mass landslides is one of the most common outcomes of that. There's some amazing building failures that have happened because of this as well. And that this was a liquefaction was quite clear from day one, from when I flew over the site in a helicopter in early July. It was crystal clear that was the mode of failure. That was the unanimous conclusion of the 6 of us from the very early days. So we never had to really ponder whether that was the failure or not. Now, that was important in part because liquefaction has very specific requirements to occur. And those are 2 pre-existing conditions that we call contractive material, in this case, crushed ore, and saturated conditions. In addition to those 2 conditions having to exist, you need a trigger mechanism. All heap leach facilities have some contractive ore in them, and all heap leach facilities have some saturated ore in them. So that those 2 conditions likely existed in the heap were pretty clear. We did verify that beyond any doubt. In fact, we know with some specificity where those occurred in the heap. But we knew they would exist. We knew we would find them. Part of that's by design. We stack heaps loose to allow the process solutions to percolate through freely. And loose is contractive. Contractive means when you shear it, like a slope failure has to happen, it compresses as it shears. As it compresses, any water in the pore space then gets pressurized. And so that's why contractive saturated material can lead to liquefaction. So we vetted those conditions early on, and then we got additional supporting information in March from the field work being done as part of the remediation study by another engineering company, which show we have profiles now of the locations in the existing, the remnant heap, that we can identify almost precisely where the liquefiable zones are and are not, or the contractive zones. It's almost all unsaturated now, so they're mostly not liquefiable anymore. So the third thing you need for liquefaction is a trigger. So our search early on focused on finding the trigger event. Next slide. The most common trigger for liquefaction failures, and the ones that tend to make the press and textbooks, are earthquake-induced liquefaction. We were able to rule out earthquakes early on because the seismic record for this part of the world is quite thorough, and there was no earthquake activity anywhere near the right timing or the right location to trigger this event. That parallels the study by another group who came to exactly the same conclusion. So that allowed us to focus on what's called static liquefaction, and that's loading by anything other than earthquake in essence. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's what it boils down to. The classic loading for static liquefaction are rapidly raising the elevation of something, like in this case, the heap. We actually see that fairly commonly in tailings dam failures for a certain class of tailings dam construction. The 2 big failures that happened in Brazil both had static liquefaction at their root. And the static liquefaction because you raise the dam too fast, or you change the water level behind the dam too fast. So in this case, we looked at the rate of the rise of the heap, and we ruled that out. It was too slow and too far away to be a plausible trigger. The next most common trigger is unloading the toe or some part of the lower slope. And you see that on highway slopes occasionally where some civil activity, construction activity will undermine the slope, and then next day that slope will release and have buried the road. That's a local static liquefaction caused by undermining the toe of the slope. So we looked at that as well. And then we also looked at the water levels inside the heap. Now this heap had very little monitoring data, so we didn't have direct readings of monitoring wells and piezometers, so we had to look at indirect evidence. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Ultimately, what we found was that there were 4 factors that created a trigger event. And let's go to the next slide. And I'll talk about, so we talk about the 5 causations. So there's 4 causations for the trigger event, and then the trigger event caused the catastrophic failure. So ore variability is at the top of our list. It's the first one we talk about for a reason. Next slide. And it's not so much that the ore was variable. All ore deposits are variable, and metal deposits especially are variable because of the nature of the geology that form the deposit. What is at the heart of this item is the inadequate management of that variability, which starts with maybe inadequate characterization, but it's more complicated than that because they did realize while they were mining that they had more variation than they thought. And then the pandemic came in 2020, and in 2020 what we found was most of the ore stacked in 2020 was among the worst ore in the deposit and worst from a geotechnical perspective. Some of that ore was actually the highest gold content ore. Why it came to be the predominant ore produced in 2020, I don't know. So I'm anticipating questions. I've gotten a lot. We didn't look at the mine planning or any of the decision-making behind the mine planning. What that material consists of is highly altered, so weathered by not so much the elements as the hot water that brought the gold in, plus the shearing zone of the faults that cause that are closely associated with the ore body formation and are commonly associated with gold ore bodies. So that material sometimes is degraded so that it comes out of the mine so fine they didn't need to crush it when they put it on the heap, where everything else got crushed quite fine. That material also has a pretty high clay content, and it classifies as a medium to high plasticity material, and plasticity is that plastic feeling you get with wet clay. That's what this material was. And during 2020, about 2/3 of the material stacked on the heap was that material, and it dominated 3 lifts in the heap, the 965, 975, and 985. That number is the elevation of the top of the lift in meters. And in those days, the lifts were 10 meters thick. And the 975 lift you'll see as a star in our report, because that lift was stacked with 76% of this poor quality material, which the operators called shear zone material. And so we adopted that in the report. That material is very low permeability and very weak. Next slide. So the second part of the equation, though, is we need water to saturate that zone. So we need to have contractive ore, and in this case, we had a variety of different kinds of ore that could cause problems, and then we needed a water source. Between the bottom of the heap and the liner system is a 600 millimeter thick gravel layer with embedded perforated pipes. That's called the pregnant leach solution collection system, or the PLS collection system. And the intent of that is to collect all the water percolating through the heap, which is now gold bearing, and carry it inside that 600 millimeter gravel layer and transmit it down to the in-heap pond at the very toe of the heap. We knew that there was some issues around how well that worked because of some historic seepage around the side of the heap. That might be my next slide. Let's see. Nope. Okay, we'll leave that there anyway. So I'll have a slide where I'll show you some of the visual evidence of that. But we knew that system didn't work perfectly, in part because of history of seepage, in part because of some of the aerial photos or drone photos we saw, some evidence of dislocated pipes. The quality of that gravel for us raised some suspicions early on. And in our Appendix J, we speak about this expressly, and I think we listed five different kinds of impairment that we know exist out there, and a couple of more that we think are likely, but we're not sure. We can't say with any confidence exactly where each of these occurred, but they likely occurred reasonably frequently across the facility and would cause local increase in depth of that water. So with those impairments accounted for, instead of the water always being inside that 600 millimeter gravel layer, in certain zones, they would be some depth higher. And we focused on a couple of problems that were probably pretty dominant across the entire facility, and that's the quality of the overliner drain fill. This has haunted me for a year. Overliner drain fill, ODF, which is that 600 millimeter gravel layer, about like that, with the embedded perforated plastic pipes in it to form the PLS collection system. So that material got finer grain, more sandy, and less visually like a drain material, as the operation got a little older. In the initial construction, it seemed like a really good quality material, and it got a little less quality. And the sand in that became a major concern because the pipes have slotted perforations, and that sand seemed like it was prone to plug those perforations. And in fact, we found test data from a fairly recent research report that looked at exactly that brand pipe, a different model in the series, and they looked at it with a sandy fill around it. And so we had some very specific impairment data from an excellent research project about 2 years or 3 years before the failure. And then we also looked at the way the small diameter distribution pipes come into the headers. So there's 100 millimeter perforated pipes that come into 250 millimeter perforated pipes. They don't actually connect. So that lack of a mechanical connection. So we looked at those two as probably being pretty common across the facility. And let's go to the next slide. So that's the ODF in contact with the perforated pipe. And the corrugations in the pipe actually act to let more sand in and keep some of the gravel out. So the material that actually touches the perforations, if you squint your eyes, you can see the little slotted perforations at the bottom of the corrugation. So what's in contact with that is almost entirely sand. None of that gravel matrix that you'd like to see to help spread the flow around. So we think that caused solution to pool over the pipes wherever it had to flow in concentrated flows. Next slide. And the mechanical joint that is most commonly used was absent here. The design was the figure on the left, which was to have the small diameter pipe overlap, the 250 millimeter pipe. I see that on a project maybe once a year. I don't know of any projects who have had major problems with it, but I've never liked it, and when I've analyzed it in the past, I've always come to the same conclusion. That's going to cause the water depth to have to be deeper at that joint, if that's the right word. But what they actually built was even a little less desirable, where they don't even have the overlap. They just butted the pipe up against. So we calculated the head loss, or head loss in pipes looks like deeper water. So we calculated the head loss at that non-mechanical connection to be between 2 and 5 meters. So the water would have gone from something like 600 millimeters or less to several meters at every joint. Then it would kind of stair step as it goes down the hill towards the in-heap pond. And that depth is related to the sandy ODF. If you had really coarse gravel, it wouldn't be as high, but you'd still be more than 600 millimeters. So those come together. And the reason this is important is this is a quirk, if that's the right word, of a valley fill leach pad, where the slopes in the heap are quite steep. And I'll get a cross section later, and I'll show you this. But in concept, each lift of ore comes all the way back and touches the top of the gravel layer until you get to some elevation much higher than this. All of the lower lifts touch the ODF layer, which means that if you have a low permeability layer, as we did in the 975 lift, and you have deeper than 600 millimeters of water in the gravel, whatever's higher than 600 meters will spill on, or 600 millimeters, sorry. I'm American, metric is new to me. So, whatever's on top of that will spill on top of the 975 lift. And that's exactly what happened here. Next slide. And we know that happened because that line of seepage that we mark as the bottom of the 985 and the top of this 975 lift, those first seeps manifested in January 2021. That lift was stacked in the summer of 2020, and the first lift of ore placed over it and irrigated in the fall of 2020. So by January 2021, you had open flow coming out of the side of that heap, and open flow in the Yukon, I don't have to tell any of you what that means, it was non-trivial flow. And then that line of seepage expanded over the years to be about a little more than half the width of the slope in that zone. There's also a little bit of seepage over to the right, up on the 995 lift, and then down around the 965 lift. That seems to have been much more localized. We know that this poor quality material came out on a regular basis, and it wasn't always well managed or well blended with the good ore. They had a protocol to blend it, but it was loosely enforced, and the protocol itself was not adequate. So we know that there's some other areas of low permeability in the heap, but none as concentrated as the 975 lift. So that's how we know the water spilled out, because you can't get water to the face of the heap unless it's got a low permeability layer and water's on top of the low permeability layer. Next slide. So the top left figure is what the system, these are cross-sections, that's what the system should have looked like if everything functioned well. The red at the bottom is the pool of water that's there by design, that's the in-heap pond. And the other colors, blue is really low saturation, yellow and greens are kind of the mid-range saturation levels you see under normal irrigation conditions in a properly functioning heap. The slide below that, so the middle slide on the left, is what happens when you assume that the PLS collection system is functioning a little worse than designed. So instead of having a few 100 millimeters of water in that gravel, you have about 2 or 3 meters. The bottom right is what happens when you put the 975 layer with 76% shear zone material in it. You now have 2 water levels in the heap, and that perched water on top of the 975 is now several meters deep. That's actually the perched water level well into the project. I'll later show you a sequence of showing how that perched water develops over time. But next, I'll go to our third causation. So the oversteepened slope, let's go back to the slide that shows the picture of the heap. There it is. I don't have a pointer, do I? Can I walk up and point? It won't be on the video. Oh, well. I'm very visual. Visualize the area on this, and I'll show you a cross-section of what that. Interrupt the web version of this. Oh, well, my apologies. So now we can go back to that. There we go. Go to the next slide, please. So the original design was 2.5 to 1. The original engineer changed that to 2.8 to 1 in 2019. It's not clear why. They said they wanted a higher factor of safety, but the factors of safety by their analysis were pretty good anyway, so I'm not quite sure what that change came from. But for this section of that slope, it's roughly twice as steep as the design. It's 1.4 to 1 instead of 2.8 to 1. Next slide. I believe the reason they did that is the original design, there's no evidence the original design considered a road up that slope. And as you saw in the picture, there is a road that zigzags. When you put a road on a slope, you either have to push the slope further back or you have to have a steeper part. If you push the slope further back, you have less capacity to stack ore on the heap. So I'm assuming that they decided to do the oversteepened slope to preserve that original crest location design. So they wound up with a 45-meter high section of ore stacked at the angle of repose, which means it had a factor of safety very close to 1. That on its own is fairly common in mining, and the price they pay is some cleanup costs, some local, you get veneer failures, you might get a road blockage that you have to clean up. And if that was the only issue, that's all this would have been, and it would have never made the press. It would have been occasional maintenance issues, and they may have gone back at some point in time and buttress that slope with rock or something. But because of the combination, and I won't walk up to the screen again, but if you look at the elevation graph on the left and you find the 975 line, you'll see that intercepts in the bottom half of that slope, of that oversteepened slope. And also, I talked about this too briefly. The 3 lifts stacked in 2020 were the 965, the 975, and the 985. Those all contained about 2/3 or more shear zone material. Those are all bad quality ore that shouldn't have been stacked there. Those dominate the lower half of that oversteepened section. So they're low strength and they're wet. So this caused a low factor of safety right in the middle of the highest slope on the heap because of steeper slope, low permeability ore, and water flowing on top of that ore. So let's go to the next slide. So until that point, what we have is a condition that's quasi-stable, a low factor of safety, but nothing bad's happened yet. So we spent a lot of time with trying to answer the question, why did this fail on June 24th, 2024? We had low factors of safety, but they weren't below 1. What changed? What changed in April 2024 is they began irrigating the south slope of the heap. Now, in the prior 2 or 3 years, they irrigated that south slope a little bit. In 2022, they irrigated 1 bench. In 2023, they irrigated 3 benches. In 2025, they irrigated 5 benches on that slope. And they put about twice as much water on that slope in 2024 as they did in any year prior to that. The total flow to the heap was about the same, but it was disproportionately loaded either towards the slope and on the slope. Let's go to the next slide. 3 of those 5 lifts were directly over the top of the 975 lift, which means that water had no chance to go into the PLS collection system. It landed on top of the 975. The lifts further up the slope flowed down to the PLS collection system, and because that system spread out over a long area, those benches may have had no impact at all on the water level. But 3 benches were right on the 975, and that water had nowhere else to go. So they started irrigating in mid-April. By May 1st, our modeling shows that the water table on the 975 started to rise. Next slide. And these show the progression of the water table leading to the slide, sorry, from mid-May to June 24th. And you can see that perched water gets deeper. It starts at a couple of meters and it winds up about 20 meters deep. And it progresses horizontally out to the face of the slope. And on June 24th, it was at its deepest and it was fully engaged with the slope. And the factor of safety of that 45-meter high portion of the heap on June 24th was about 0.89 to 1. Now, you can't have less than 1, so it failed somewhere in that period. I'll show you a slide of that in a second, but if you look at the lower right, the red lines are the geometry of the failure. It looks small on that slope, and in mining context, it's a modest-sized slope failure. But it was 45 meters high, it reached back about 75 meters into the heap, and it was about 150 meters wide. So it was about 300,000 tons of ore in that zone. So that's a pretty good sized slide. That's not the catastrophic failure, but that's the trigger for the catastrophic failure. So the trigger for this failure was the rising water table on the 975. Next slide. And that's those lines show the factors of safety on that slope over time based on the water table rise. The top blue line is if there was no irrigation. So the factor of safety was too low, but it wasn't anywhere near failure. And when they started irrigating, the factors of safety started to decline. And the 2 lower lines, the gray and yellow lines, are our best estimates of what the permeability of the shear zone material right near the face. We don't actually have samples of that because it's flowed down Dublin Gulch, and we don't know where it is now. But we know from the test data on the site and from the testimony that it's probably in the range of those 2 lines. And as you can see from that graph, we cross the factor of safety of 1.0 right on June 24th. So we can't tell you exactly what the properties of that ore is, but we can tell you it's between those 2 lines somewhere. Go back 1 slide, please. When that slide started to move, now it started to move in that 2-month period, so from May 1, when the water table first started to rise, until June 24, so that's 7.5 weeks. The factor of safety was dropping, and as the factor of safety reduces, you'll start to see some movement. but it wouldn't be measurable until the factor of safety drops below about 1.1. Go back to the next slide. Now, I can't see that far. Now I have to walk, sorry. At a factor of safety of about 1.1, slopes start to move enough that you can measure them and sometimes enough that you can see them. So probably around June 1st, there would have been some evidence of distress on that slope, but there's no operators down there. This is not an area where people were going routinely, and there'd be no reason for an operator to be down there, and there was no instrumentation on the slope, so they didn't know this was happening, but there would have been some evidence. Some people postulated in the early days that a pipe broke 5 minutes before the failure, and people postulate that that caused the failure. We investigated that, and there is essentially no chance that that's what happened. We think the pipe failed because the slope was moving enough to break the pipe, and that's completely consistent with that graph and this theory. Go forward again, please. So that leads us to the liquefiable ore. This slope failure is, we have essentially 100% confidence that this is what happened. There's physical evidence in that the photos of the slope before and after the failure match almost precisely what our numerical modeling says the slope looked like and where it triggered. Within meters, we have the toe and the crest of those failures showing up in the photographs. So we know that happened. What happened after that is chaotic. Go to the next slide, please. So liquefaction is this sudden loss of strength because you're causing saturated contractive ore to contract. The water pressure skyrockets, and as it skyrockets, the properties of the material change. The shear strength, which holds everything up, collapses. In this case, we know from testing and modeling that the shear strength went down by a factor of about 4 during this process of contracting. So the original design engineers used a friction angle of 38 in their stability modeling. In this period, and this period is very short, and I'll give you a timeline in a moment, the friction angle went from 38 degrees to the development of pore pressure where it went down to about 17 degrees. And then as the pore pressure brought the factor of safety below 1.1, it then mobilized what we call residual strength. And that's like friction. It takes more effort to get the pool table to move than to keep the pool table moving. It's exactly the same in soil mechanics. And so it went from 38 degrees to 17 degrees to 10 degrees. And in shear strength parameters, that's a little bit more than a 4-fold reduction in the strength. And that's what liquefaction is. Next slide. So the inner ramp failure was triggered by the rising perched water level caused by the heavy irrigation in 2024 of those benches. As that material started to slide, it caused the ore behind it to start to relax. Unloading a slope is a classic trigger for liquefaction. So the material behind it started to slip and then liquefy. The material to the east started to slip and liquefy because the first block moved southwest. We know that definitively, again, from the photo evidence, but also from the survey data. And as it moved southwest, we left that fairly steep scarp that everybody sees in the pictures. That's the upper scarp or the eastern scarp. That area in there has classic signs of very local liquefaction. And this whole mass, which is now, it's gone from 300,000 tons to several million tons, and it moved about 100 meters south and about 40 meters vertically down. That then compressed the ore in the in-heap pond, and the entire mass in the in-heap pond liquefied. And that's what was squeezed out over the top of the dam, as I was reminded this morning, like a toothpaste tube. And that's what caused the final failure at the very top, which is just slumping of the slope as everything kind of fell out from under it. So there's 4 stages, but it's that liquefaction failure where nominally 2 million tons of liquefied ore was pushed out over the top of the dam and flowed down Ann Gulch into Dublin Gulch. That whole process It started in April with irrigation. It took about 2 months for the local inner ramp failure to happen. And once the inner ramp failure started, it took 10 seconds for the first ton of ore to cross the top of the dam. And we know that with some precision from interviews, from the pump and the electrical data from the site, and connecting those dots, 10 seconds. 10 seconds from trigger to leaving containment. These things happen very fast. They happen lightning fast. Next slide. I'm sure you've seen pictures like this, but these are textbook liquefaction failures. These pictures or pictures like them will wind up in textbooks and professional papers about liquefaction and heap leaching. Next slide. So, how do we prevent this from happening again? I think this is by far the most important part of the work we did over the last year. We came up with 50 recommendations that took us months to vet amongst all of us. These speak to industry practices and licensing and regulatory practices. They also speak to the mine waste guidelines, which are part of the licensing practice. We've made recommendations that you can divide into governance, risk management, and prescriptive requirements. We don't present them that way because I think they're more digestible to talk about industry practices and regulatory practices. But I tend to avoid prescriptive requirements because I think most of our benefit comes from the other two categories. But in this case, there needed to be some prescriptive standards. I think there needs to be, in part because of things that weren't done here that are, in hindsight, are a little surprising. So we have some prescriptive standards, but the recommendations dominantly are non-prescriptive. More risk management, more governance, more procedures, more policies, one of which is review boards. We know review boards work from the tailings industry, and that's one of our most important recommendations. Next slide. So just kind of a sampling of the kinds of recommendations in there in terms of conceptually the things we're covering. And we have independent review boards on there. More robustness in the design, more robustness in surveillance. This site had almost no surveillance, so we think the bar should be vastly higher than this site. But honestly, the practice in the industry isn't high enough. I've had this conversation with a number of other companies in the business before this failure. We need better surveillance of these facilities across the board. The project that failed in Turkey early last year had surveillance. Had they followed their own guidelines, they wouldn't have prevented the failure, but they would have prevented any serious injuries. So surveillance works. Next slide. We did not do a deep dive into the licensing practices here since we don't find any direct linkage between licensing and these failures. But we did recommend a number of licensing improvements that we see elsewhere that are successful. So these flow from practices in other jurisdictions, practices that have come out of a number of industry organizations that we know are successful. So these are not hypothetical recommendations, these are tested recommendations. A lot of them come from the tailings industry, which has had a vastly worse time than heap leaching, so they've learned their lessons earlier than heap leaching. So, next slide. The waste guidelines for waste management, that's what it's called. Those were drafted over about a 10 or 12 year period and released in January of 2023. It's an excellent document, but it also dates back now over a decade, and it's time to update that. So we've recommended specifically that a panel be convened to do a deep dive into those and bring them current, especially in light of the two major failures last year, the two biggest failures in heap leach history. And then we've made some recommendations on places to start, but what we really want is for the procedure to happen and with the right people to put in the right place. And one of the things we say in the report is that we think the regulatory process here knows how to do that. And we think that it can be handled inside of that current system. And so that's our express recommendation. We don't see any need to start from scratch on any of this. We think this is a build from lessons learned approach. Next slide. That's the end. So now we invite questions.
Yes.
And I'll
Thank you,
endeavor to
Mr.
have answers.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We'll now open the floor to questions, and Mr. Conrad is available to take questions in French. A reminder that the focus of the briefing is for the Independent Review Board to talk about their findings and recommendations in the final report. For specific questions to the Government of Yukon, please follow up with us after the briefing. We will begin with reporters in the room. Please, one question at a time and one follow-up question, and then please hand the mic back when you're done. And then we will turn to reporters remotely. And for reporters joining remotely, please indicate when you have a question. So in the room, let's start with Sarah from Radio Canada. If you're not ready, yeah, if you're ready?
Yeah,
Great.
I am, but it's, both going to be in French, if it's okay.
I'll need a little help.
C'est correct? Oh,
Or Jean-Marie can answer. Yeah.
Yeah. So, le rapport détermine que le déversement est dû à une conjoncture. Est-ce que si plus de surveillance avait été mise en place, est-ce qu'on aurait eu les signaux d'alarme que ce soit déclenché avant?
Jean-Marie, you're muted.
Oui, merci Sarah pour la question. D'ailleurs, c'est une très bonne question et j'y avais pensé. Effectivement, l'instrumentation est un élément essentiel dans quelle que soit la structure, qui ont des matériaux comme des minerais broyés. Donc, la question, c'est qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait mesurer? Donc, c'est clair que si on avait pu mesurer le niveau de la nappe phréatique dans le talus, on aurait pu envisager une problématique parce que ces talus sont conçus pour être relativement non saturés, donc pas nécessairement d'avoir des quantités d'eau énormes dans l'intérieur de ces talus. Donc, je pense que effectivement, l'instrumentation est un élément à considérer.
Puis, une autre question, c'est vraiment en lien avec les recommandations. Est-ce qu'elles sont spécifiques à la lixiviation en tas et est-ce que ça peut s'appliquer à l'ensemble de l'industrie minière au Yukon, pardon?
Oui, non, c'est clair qu'elle n'est pas forcément spécifique aux lixiviations en tas. Beaucoup de ces recommandations, en fait, proviennent déjà de l'industrie minière dans les résidus miniers. Donc, on a un peu, si vous voulez, on les a étendus un peu à ce cas de lixivation d'État.
thank you. And next, we'll go to Gabrielle Plonka from CBC North.
Hi. So thank you for the presentation. So obviously the review alludes to a series of errors which contributed to the failure. Did you get a sense that the issues were present from the beginning of the mine's life, or did something change along the way? Did the mining practices along the way change?
The first on our list of problems is the inadequately managed variability of the ore and the very poor quality ore. That ore was stacked for almost all of 2020. So they were still ramping up the full production. They started stacking, I think the first ore went on the heap maybe in August 2019. And I think the first gold pour was in the fall of 2019. So they were in the early days of production. And we didn't look at the quality of the ore in the in-heap pond, although we know that ore was finer crushed. But we didn't otherwise really look at the quality of it because we were looking at the trigger mechanism. But yeah, I would say it started very early. I don't understand how or why the mine geology was such that it was that they got into the high volume of shear zone material for essentially all of 2020. But yeah, it was during the ramp-up period, and then slightly after the first anniversary of stacking ore.
Thank you. And I want to ask about the recommendations. There's a lot of them.
There are a lot of them.
If you could choose one or a couple, which are the most urgent to you?
If I had to pick one, I would have mandatory independent technical review boards on all significant projects. So significant being Class 2 and Class 3 by the Yukon Mine Waste Management Guidelines. Why? We know from tailings facilities, well, in fact, this was a claim made by another engineer right after the Mount Poly tailings dam failure, and when he said it, I wondered if it was true, and 10 or 12 years later, I can't find an exception. No tailings dam that's been under a review board has ever failed. And tailings dams are much more complicated, and they fail at a much higher rate than tailings facilities. And when they fail, they are almost always fatal. Mount Poly was a bit of good luck that nobody was hurt in that. And if they work on that, the geomechanics are the same. So it's a very empirical approach to that recommendation.
And next, let's go to Macklin from CKRW.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious how common the factors that led to this failure are seen in maybe other heap leaches or heap leach failures.
Well, the presence of the contractive and saturated ore is a natural condition in heap leaching. We don't think about it this way, but it's almost by design. The combinations that got them to a point where there was a trigger event that wasn't an earthquake was a little unique, although all the projects struggle with variable ore, and that variability it's never all good. So there's lots of projects out there that have some poor quality ore and that we have to come up with special measures to handle it. It usually shows up in operations because the same material that has bad geotechnical properties also has bad metallurgical properties. So this is entirely speculation, but it's hard to believe they got all the gold out of that material. And we know that some of the shear zone material was some of the highest grade ore on the property. So how that got missed is a little bit surprising to me. Metallurgy and geotechnical behavior go hand in hand, although it is a little bit more common than I'd like that the industry doesn't connect the two. We don't couple those two practices when we design or operate these things. We built silos around big projects, and that is maybe part of the root cause of some of the problems in the mining industry, that we silo, compartmentalize the different practices. But we only ever had, in the history of heap leaching, we've had 6 significant failures, 4 you could call catastrophic, and 2 of those were slope failures. So in the 45-year history, we've had 2 major slope failures, compared to tailings dams where we have about 5 a year.
And another thing you mentioned was having a sort of higher surveillance. Assuming, or if that surveillance was in place, how predictable would this failure have been?
The liquefaction component is hard to predict because it happens so fast. The trigger event, however, is reasonably predictable. I mentioned the failure in Turkey, and I don't know how many people here have looked at that, but that was a larger and deadly failure. That failure, their surveillance data, their survey data, showed they were on the path to failure about 4 days before the failure. Probably too late to stop the failure, but not too late to take protective actions against the people that ultimately died. That may be the same here. Nobody was injured, so there isn't that to deal with. But sometime in that 2-month period when that factor of safety was dropping towards 1 on the inner ramp, 45-meter section, there would have been measurable deformation that I would like to think would raise a red flag and somebody would look deeper. And since the irrigation on the slope was obvious to anybody, that would be the likely culprit, that's the kind of reaction where if they had seen that data and then turned those sprinklers off, it may have stopped the failure completely. It's easier to say that in hindsight, though, so I'm completely aware that I have that advantage.
And next, Stuart Bunnell from Shone FM.
Thank you. How likely, 50 recommendations, how likely is it that a similar incident could occur again if all of the recommendations are implemented appropriately?
You mean in general on another heap leach project? Yeah. So the failure rate in heap leaching is about 1 in 2,500 or 1 in 3,000, which means if you had 300 heap leach facilities in the Yukon, you would expect 1 failure in 10 years, to put it into kind of manageable numbers. I don't think you'll ever have 300 heap leach facilities. So if you had 30, you'd have 1 every 100 years. That's, you know, that's using statistics and not exactly the way they're meant to be. And you can manage that through the factors that we've said, we've recommended. In tailings, the failure rate, and these are harder facilities that fail more often, the failure rate of tailings dams with review boards is 0. I would think we could get to 0 or very close to 0 with review boards on heap leaching. I'm gonna put an annex on that. And we don't talk enough about this. So in terms of design, safe design, there's 2 factors. And we talk a lot about things like factor of safety. That's more broadly what is often called robustness. So robustness is high factors of safety, redundant components, you know, backup systems, that kind of stuff. Like in the pumping system here, they had a spare pump. That's not a factor of safety. That's a robust feature through redundancy. But the other part of safe design is building in resilience. And resilience is not factor of safety or redundant systems. Resilience is a larger, more holistic approach to build safety in, and that includes training, oversight, surveillance, project and company governance, thorough and well-informed inspections. But it also includes, and this is maybe the most tangible part, is failure modes that are less catastrophic. So every human construct has a risk of failure, and we can make that risk lower and lower, but we can also make the consequences lower and lower. So if you cut the likelihood by 10% or by a factor of 10, and you cut the consequences by a factor of 10, what you now have is a low probability of a not very important failure. And that's where we should target every facility. Things can go wrong, but they don't go badly wrong. They don't become catastrophic failures.
And just for clarity, does that mindset and that preventative mindset, I suppose, does that play a role in the recommendations that were made following the heap leach failure?
Yes, our recommendations embrace some of those governance requirements or parameters, and we've even reached out to some of the policies that are being established in some of the mining organizations like the Mining Association of Canada and the International Council on Metal and Mines, which have, they don't focus on prescriptive, they focus on policies and procedures and preventative. We even cite the prevailing concept in worker safety, accident protection. It's all about prevention and the mindset going in.
And next, EPTN, Sarah Connors.
Did you happen to find any evidence, maybe of Victoria Gold, I guess you could phrase it as like cutting corners in their operation of the mine as possibly a way to cut cost or maybe as an efficiency measure?
That's a good question and a difficult question because we're always trying to save costs and therefore we're always cutting corners. So how can we connect the dots between that and the failure? Not having surveillance is a cost-saving exercise. I can't speak to the mindset when the decision was made to do kind of a de minimis approach. So you have to know somebody's motive to really fully answer that question, and I don't have any real insight to anybody's motive here. But it's unquestionable that some things could have been done better, and some of those better practices could have reduced the failure, or, prevented the failure, but could and would are different words on purpose, so.
And you said there was almost no surveillance at this site. In your experience, how common is that to see a site with very little surveillance?
It distresses me to say far too common.
And now let's go to Dana from the Yukon News.
So you talk about the causes. So how could this have been prevented?
Each of our 5 causes have a prevention. And I don't think I said this in my presentation, which is an oversight. All 5 of those things had to happen at the same time for this catastrophe to happen. If we only had the first 4 and no liquefiable ore, it would have been a failure, but it wouldn't have been a catastrophe. If we didn't have the poor quality ore in those 3 lifts, there wouldn't have been any of it. If we had a fully functional PLS collection system, there wouldn't have been any of this. So getting any one of those right would have prevented this failure. That doesn't mean it wouldn't have failed. And an example of how another way it could have failed is the liquefaction risk existed without any of the first 4 causations, and that made the heap vulnerable to an earthquake-induced liquefaction, which would have looked a lot like this failure. But they haven't had an earthquake, so, and the likelihood of an earthquake strong enough to cause liquefaction is pretty small, but not remotely zero.
I have other questions, so I'm hoping we can connect for an interview soon. But why not recommend a public inquiry? You know, like the First Nation of Nacho Dun, the Yukon NDP, other groups have called for a public inquiry, and I'm wondering, was that outside your purview, or why not call for a full public inquiry into the failure?
Part of the answer is nobody asked us to opine on that. We've been asked since the report came out. And my opinion has been, I'm neutral on it. What I don't know, and I'm not sure that everybody has the same idea in mind, but what purpose would that public inquiry serve? Because it depends on the purpose. I think my answer would depend on the purpose of the inquiry. If it's to place blame for financial liability, then that falls into the civil litigation. If it's to create a more robust mining industry, that's our recommendations. So.
And just to add to that from the government of Yukon, as Mark has been talking about, Mr. Smith, the independent review was to identify the causes and factors contributing to the heap leach failure. The scope of the board's work was not to assign responsibility for the failure. And the government of Yukon has previously said that we needed this report before making any decisions about a potential public inquiry. And the Yukon government is reviewing these findings to determine next steps, and we'll have more to say soon. And now let's move to the online media. We have 2 journalists who've indicated questions so far, and we'll start with Blair McBride from the Northern Miner.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm curious to know why the IRB didn't attach any dollar figures to potential better practices or solutions.
That's an interesting question. My first response is it didn't even cross our mind. But I also think part of it is that none of our recommendations are particularly expensive, but to actually put a cost on them would take a significant amount of work and would be very project specific. But it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one more thing. It really was a question of time. We received data in mid-May. We had to deliver that report by June 30th. And as Mark said, it never crossed our mind to put their cost estimate on the recommendation. That was not even in our term of references. But yeah, I mean, putting together an ITRB is not that costly, and reviewing all the other requirements. Anyway, that's my answer to your question.
I think a different approach to that question might be this. The cost that the Yukon taxpayers have been burdened with for this failure would fund all of our recommendations on every mining project that will ever be proposed in the Yukon.
Blair, do you have a follow-up question?
Sorry, it cut out a bit of the second part of his response there. Could he please repeat that?
Yeah, you bet. So I am certain, am I certain? I'm pretty sure that the cost burden that's now been put on the Yukon taxpayers for the Eagle Gold failure would fund all of our recommendations on every mining project that will ever be proposed in the Yukon. So I think cost-wise, it's nothing in comparison.
Did you catch that, Blair?
Yes, I
Blair,
did. Yeah.
great. And do you have a follow-up question for the review board members?
Yeah, basically, like you mentioned earlier that you think that if you were to put a dollar figure to any of your recommendations, that it would actually amount to not very much in terms of safety measures. Could you expand on that a bit more?
Well, the review board, for example, a robust review board for a complex mine, so a mine like Eagle or much bigger, might cost $250,000 a year. On a project, I don't know what Eagle would cost to build today, but it's probably $500 million. So it would cost you maybe $250,000 for a robust review board.
Thanks. Next, we have a question from Brenna Owen from the Canadian Press Online.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm just going to assume that you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm actually wondering, you've been speaking a little bit about the difference between tailings and heap leach. How many of these heap leach facilities are there in Yukon, across Canada? And has there been outreach to those facilities about these recommendations?
The how many in the Yukon is currently 0. There's, I think, a couple in the conceptual stages. In Canada, there's not many. I'm struggling to think of one, but I'm pretty sure there's more than 0, but not very many in Canada. One of our technical advisors is the chief technical officer for the largest Canadian-based gold producer with significant heap leach facilities, and he had a major hand in the recommendations.
And so, have other jurisdictions or mines or heap leach facilities been reaching out from like beyond your work in Yukon in relation to what happened, and kind of like, have you seen other interests? Because you have mentioned a couple of times that your recommendations go beyond even just like what specifically happened here and are meant to be kind of broader for the whole industry.
Yeah, I've gotten calls. I think in the months following the failure, I got calls as often as daily for a while, and now it's not that often. And everybody in the business who knows me knows I'm working on this board and that I can't talk about it until now. But I get contacted often. It's from mining companies, it's also from regulators, and it's from insurance companies and from major investors about what's the future of heap leaching, where is this going. I am in parallel the lead editor on the first ever guidelines for heap and dump leaching that will be published in 2027, and we speak to that in our report. That study was commissioned before either of the two failures. That study was commissioned in the fall of 2023 as a interesting bit of coincidence. And we're gonna pre-publish the first chapter on that, which is hazard classification, in September, and that will be a public document. And the group behind that, that's entirely funded by industry. There's about a dozen corporate sponsors, all major mining companies, all of which have interest in heap leaching. So there's a lot of, the industry's paying a lot of attention to this, and not because they're interested in working in the Yukon. I don't know individually their interest in the Yukon, but they know that the two failures of 2024 are going to define the next 10 or 20 years for heap leach practice.
Are there any other media outlets online that have a question? No? Well, I think we're at time. We are at time. I thank you all, members of the media here and online, for joining us, and thank you to the Independent Review Board members, Mark Smith and Jean-Marie Conrad.